Mexico City. It's the middle of the day, and suddenly, the highways start closing. Cars burn on overpasses. Armed men appear on roads that should be filled with commuters. Within hours, it spreads across the country. Airports shut down. Schools close. Entire cities lock their doors as smoke rises over the skyline. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of a war, but because the cartels decided to send a message. And the message was terrifyingly simple. They could shut Mexico down whenever they want. Within hours, highways across the nation were burning. Airports were shut down. Entire cities locked themselves indoors as armed men flooded the streets. In more than a dozen states, cartel gunmen set vehicles on fire, blocked major roads, and brought normal life to a complete standstill. Schools closed. Tourists fled beach resorts. Police disappeared from the streets. And the message from the cartels was unmistakable. They weren't just fighting the government anymore. They were demonstrating something far more dangerous. They could paralyze the entire country whenever they wanted. Because what the cartels just did, it wasn't just another act of violence. It was proof that Mexico may have already crossed the point of no return. So, what exactly happened? On February 22nd of 2026, Mexico's military tracked the country's most wanted man to a mountain town called Talpapa in the western state of Jalisco. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, had a $15 million bounty on his head from the United States. He was 59 years old, a former police officer, a former avocado farmer, and the founder of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, which the FBI considered the most powerful criminal organization in all of Mexico. El Mencho had been a ghost for years, so paranoid about surveillance that all known photos of him were decades old, so careful about his movements that even senior cartel figures rarely knew where he was. He co-founded the CJNG around 2007 and spent nearly 2 decades building it into something the DEA considered to be as powerful as the Sinaloa cartel, with a confirmed presence in all 50 U.S. states. The U.S. had been indicting him since 2017. Washington had been pushing Mexico to act. The intel that finally cracked his location came through an associate connected to one of El Mencho's romantic partners, the kind of personal vulnerability that even the most paranoid men can't always eliminate. Special forces moved in before dawn. Cartel gunmen opened fire immediately. Soldiers killed several CJNG members at the compound. El Mencho and 2 bodyguards fled into the surrounding woods, where a second firefight erupted. When troops finally cornered him, he was wounded. He died during transport to Mexico City. The most wanted man in 2 countries was gone. Within hours, the retaliation began. Across 22 states, cartel operatives launched a coordinated nationwide response that looked less like grief and more like a military operation. 252 roadblocks appeared across the country. Highways burned. Convenience stores went up in flames. Gas stations exploded. Armed convoys moved openly through city streets in broad daylight. In Guadalajara, a city of 5 million people and a scheduled host for 4 matches at the 2026 FIFA World Cup, the governor declared a code red, suspended all public transport, and told residents to stay home. Delta, American Airlines, Alaska, and Air Canada all canceled flights in and out of Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara. At the beach resort of Puerto Vallarta, dark smoke billowed over the bay while tourists scrambled to find shelter. The U.S. Embassy issued a shelter-in-place warning for Americans across 5 states. By the end of the weekend, at least 25 members of Mexico's National Guard had been killed in the violence. The CJNG had put a price on soldiers' heads, 20,000 pesos, roughly $1,000 for every military member killed. Stop and think about that for a second. Within hours of losing their leader, a criminal organization plunged an entire nation into coordinated chaos. Not a failed state in the middle of a civil war, but Mexico, a G20 economy, a country of about 130 million people, a FIFA World Cup host, brought to its knees by a cartel's revenge attack. President Claudia Sheinbaum went on social media to insist that the situation was normalizing, but the damage was already visible to the world. A single cartel had paralyzed the country in under a day. But the shutdown itself wasn't the real story. The real story is why the cartels were able to do it at all. Here's what most people outside of Mexico don't fully understand. The CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel are no longer just criminal gangs running drugs across a border. In many parts of the country, they operate as something else entirely. Parallel governments, competing states, organizations with their own territories, laws, tax systems, and their own courts. In regions across Jalisco, Michoacan, Guerrero, and beyond, cartel bosses decide who can do what business, who can travel on which roads, and in some cases, who gets to stay in a town at all. They collect what locals call war taxes, a cut from everything: corner stores, restaurants, construction projects, farms, even road vendors. They run informal justice when disputes arise. They enforce curfews in areas where the government has effectively stopped showing up, and that's a lot of Mexico's territory. The cartel fills the void. Roads get patrolled. Order, brutal as it is, gets maintained. One recent report described cartel financial power as having grown so vast it enables them to exert significant influence over local governments and authorities. That's the careful academic version. But the blunter version is this. In large swaths of Mexico, the cartel aren't competing with the government, they've replaced it. And the local police? Well, in many of those regions, they're either on the payroll or they've fled. The numbers on corruption are hard to fully absorb. Mexico's justice system overwhelmingly fails to punish organized crime at any level. Police officers who refuse cartel money, well, they get shot. Mayors who don't cooperate disappear. Federal prosecutors working cartel cases receive funeral wreaths delivered to their offices as warnings. This isn't occasional corruption, it's systemic capture. When the 2025 Mexico Peace Index described organized crime as a defining feature of Mexico's security landscape, it's describing a country where the criminal and the official have become functionally intertwined in large parts of the country. But if the cartels are already governing parts of Mexico, how did the government lose control in the first place? Well, that answer goes back years, and it's the story of a strategy that kept failing, kept costing lives, and kept making things immeasurably worse every single time. Mexico's war on the cartels officially began in 2006, when President Felipe Calderón deployed tens of thousands of soldiers to cartel strongholds across the country. The theory was intuitive: cut off the head, kill the snake. Target the kingpins, dismantle the leadership, and the organizations will collapse from the top down. Well, they did not collapse, they just fragmented. When you arrest or kill a cartel boss, you don't destroy the organization, you destroy its structure. And then every lieutenant, every regional commander, every allied gang scrambles to fill the vacuum. What was one powerful cartel becomes 5 smaller, hungrier, more brutal ones competing for the same territory. In the decade following Calderón's offensive, Mexico's homicide rate didn't fall, it nearly doubled. Over 300,000 people were murdered in Mexico in the last decade alone. That's not the result of a war being won, that's the result of a strategy being failed, repeatedly, while the body count kept climbing. The CJNG was built differently from its predecessors, though. El Mencho trained his organization like a paramilitary force. One expert compared the philosophy to Genghis Khan: wipe out the opposition completely. Use the brutality as a warning to everyone watching. Cartel armored vehicles, drone strikes, rocket launchers. The CJNG wasn't playing by the old cartel rules. They were writing new ones. Their response to El Mencho's death wasn't disorganized grief. It was rehearsed, coordinated, executed across 22 states in hours. And as the cartels multiplied and hardened, something even more dangerous began to happen. They stopped just being criminals. They became the economy. This is the part that rarely makes international headlines. The cartels don't just move drugs. They now control significant portions of Mexico's real economy. In Michoacan, criminal groups effectively run the avocado industry, one of Mexico's most valuable agricultural exports. They control access to orchards, charge farmers for the right to harvest, and tax the trucks that carry the produce to the market. They moved into illegal mining, logging, and construction. They steal fuel directly from government pipelines in an industrial-scale operation that Mexicans call huachicol, which has cost the country billions of dollars before anyone seriously tried to stop it. Entire regional supply chains depend on cartel permission to function. And then there's fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. Mexican cartels, primarily the CJNG and Sinaloa, import precursor chemicals from China, manufacture fentanyl in clandestine labs hidden across Jalisco and Michoacan, press them into counterfeit pills, and then push them across the U.S. border by the millions. 2 milligrams is a lethal dose. That means cartels can make extraordinary profits from tiny volumes, and those profits can buy weapons, recruits, and territory. The Trump administration designated the CJNG and Sinaloa as foreign terrorist organizations in early 2025, partly because of fentanyl, and the U.S. had been pushing Mexico to act. The El Mencho operation was, at least in part, a result of that pressure. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace, the total economic cost of violence in Mexico reached $245 billion in 2024. That is 18% of Mexico's entire GDP. $1 in every 6 that Mexico's economy should produce, consumed by violence, extortion, displacement, and destruction. Meanwhile, Mexico's overall GDP growth rate in recent years has barely registered, hovering around 0.5% to 1%. Businesses don't invest in states where they might get taxed by a cartel. Tourists don't return to resorts that they've seen burning on the news. The cartels are quietly strangling the economy that the Mexican government needs to fund the fight against them. But here's what's coming up next. If you want to follow how nations lose control in real time, this is exactly why Fall of Nations exists. Subscribe, because what we haven't covered yet is the part of this story that is genuinely irreversible. Because the economy's numbers, well, they're almost easy to understand compared to what's happening inside of Mexico's justice system. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Approximately 95% of violent crimes in Mexico go unpunished. That comes from a formal legal analysis in the Mexican Law Review. Human Rights Watch reports only 16 out of every 100 criminal cases reach any resolution at all. Less than 1% of crimes are fully solved. And the rest, the murders, kidnappings, disappearances, they go unanswered. In a country where over 300,000 people were killed in the last decade. More than 150,000 people were listed as missing in Mexico as of late 2024. Most have been gone since the drug war began in 2006. Authorities and activists have uncovered nearly 6,000 clandestine graves between 2007 and 2023. In 2022 alone, 15,000 human remains processed by Mexican morgues could not be identified. Families spent years searching for people who may have been buried in unmarked graves under a different name. In 2024, at least 201 politically motivated assassinations were reported in Mexico, the deadliest year on record for public officials. Judges have been bought or quietly threatened into inaction. And in the aftermath of El Mencho's death, the CJNG was reportedly offering cash bounties for every soldier killed, the same way a normal company might post a job opening. When criminals know that they'll never be caught, never prosecuted, never punished, well, brutality doesn't level off. It accelerates, year after year, without a ceiling. So ask yourself, if 95% of crimes go unpunished, if the police are compromised, if the judges are afraid, what would actually stop a young man with no other options from joining? This is the demographic reality that never makes the news cycle, and it may be the most frightening part of this entire story. Organized crime in Mexico employs an estimated 170,000 to 185,000 people, a workforce the size of a mid-sized city. According to a study reported by The Guardian, cartels rank among the country's largest employers, and they're not struggling to fill positions. Mexico has severe youth unemployment, deep generational poverty across its southern and rural states, chronic underinvestment in education, job training, and basic infrastructure. For a young man in Michoacan or Guerrero or Guanajuato with no job, no prospects, no safety net, and no realistic path forward, a cartel offer, it doesn't feel like a moral fall. It looks like a salary, a community, and a form of power and respect he has never experienced. And in some communities, it's genuinely the only stable income in sight. Experts have said it clearly. Until Mexico offers real alternatives, cartels are going to keep replenishing their ranks faster than the state can deplete them. They don't have a recruitment crisis. They've got waiting lists. And once a criminal organization reaches this scale, something shifts. Something psychological. Something that makes the whole equation almost impossible to reverse. Fear becomes normal. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a single violent event, but the slow, grinding, ambient fear of a population that's learned to stop expecting safety. Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. From 2000 to 2022, 63 journalists have been killed. Thousands more have been attacked or threatened. Many simply stopped covering cartel activity. Not under any formal order, but because they understood exactly what would happen if they didn't. Self-censorship has become so normalized in parts of Mexico that entire regions operate without any meaningful press coverage of the cartels controlling them. The truth doesn't get out because the people who would tell it have learned to stay silent or relocate. Businesses pay protection money not because a thug appears once, but because they've seen what happened to the owners who said no. Communities in cartel territory don't just tolerate the presence, they reorganize their lives around it. Which roads to take, which hours to avoid, which questions are never spoken aloud. An entire generation of Mexicans has grown up never knowing what a country without this feels like. This is not a crime problem. This is a civilizational one. A country doesn't collapse in a single moment. It collapses slowly, neighborhood by neighborhood, road by road, until one morning, the illusion of control is just gone. And that brings us to the question that no one in Mexico's government wants to answer directly. Has Mexico already crossed the point of no return? When a state loses its monopoly on violence, when it can no longer guarantee safety to its own citizens across its own territory, historians call it a fragile state. Mexico is not there officially. It has a functioning democracy, a central bank, a Supreme Court, federal institutions, but in significant portions of Mexican territory, none of those institutions reach. The cartels control the roads. They run regional economies. They influence who gets elected at the municipal level. The federal government's authority extends only as far as the cartels allow it to. That's not governance. That's a permission structure. Consider this. In 2024, the economic impact of violence in Mexico cost the equivalent of 18% of GDP. For every dollar the government spent trying to counter that violence, the damage amounted to nearly $6. The cartels are not just winning the security war, they're winning the economic war too. And every year that passes without structural reform, real judicial reform, real investment in poor communities, real alternatives for young Mexicans, well, that's another year that the cartels use to consolidate ground they will not give back. And as the rest of the world just watched, Guadalajara, a modern, cosmopolitan city preparing to host 3 million World Cup visitors in June of 2026, was turned into a ghost town within hours. Smoke over beach hotels, U.S. tourists told to shelter in place. The eyes of the planet were already on Mexico. The CJNG, well, they chose exactly that moment to show how much of it they own. Analysts warn it could cost Mexico billions in lost tourism revenue and damaged investment reputation. Damage that will outlast the violence itself. Experts now warn that El Mencho's death won't shrink the cartel. It will ignite a violent succession war that could redefine Mexico's criminal map for years. Regional commanders with their own armies and trafficking corridors have no incentive to cooperate. Every rival cartel will probe the vacancy. Every community caught between them will pay the price. And the government, the same government that just killed the most wanted man in 2 countries, will be forced to watch as the organization it dismantled simply reorganizes around new leadership. Potentially more dangerous for having no single point of failure at the top. The cartels didn't destroy Mexico overnight. They hollowed it out slowly, decade by decade, community by community, institution by institution, until one February morning, the men with the guns stopped hiding. They walked the streets openly. They burned the highways in front of cameras. They put bounties on soldiers like it was ordinary business. And a country of 130 million people locked its doors and waited for it to pass. They were already running the show. So here's the question we'll leave you with. If the kingpin strategy had failed every single time, if every major takedown has only scattered the violence, multiplied the factions, and left the country more unstable than before, what does Mexico actually do next? More military operations, more extraditions, or something completely different? Real judicial reform, real economic investment in the communities that feed the cartels their recruits. Is there a version of this story that ends differently, or has the rot gone too deep to reverse? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you want to follow the stories that show how nations actually fall apart, one institution, one community, one generation at a time, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We'll be here.